Hello and welcome again to Economic Solutions. I'm Leonard Zane, and we are very fortunate today to have a special program by electronic hookup to Washington, D.C. We are speaking to economist Bruce Bartlett, who was an advisor to presidents of the United States. He is an author of many books that are very well received, that have been on the New York Times bestseller list. We are going to be talking about his current book, which is called The Benefit and the Burden, Tax Reform, Why We Need It and What It Will Take. And I'm going to read a little bit about Bruce Bartlett's background. Bruce Bartlett is a columnist for the economics blog of the New York Times, for the Fiscal Times, an online newspaper covering the economy, business, and personal finance, and for Tax Notes, a weekly magazine for tax policymakers and practitioners. Bartlett's work is informed by many years in government, including service on the staffs of Congressman Ron Paul and Jack Kemp and Senator Roger Jespin, as staff director of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, senior policy analyst in the Reagan White House, and deputy assistant secretary for economic policy at the Treasury Department during the George H.W. Bush administration. On a previous show, we also featured or mentioned another book of his, The New American Economy. And this is a fascinating book that came out just 2009, I believe. And again, we recommend that people read this book as well. We recommend the current tax reform book. And we have set up questions to ask Mr. Bartlett based on the current book. About 10 questions, which we forwarded to him in advance because we wanted to be able to have a considered response, not sound bites. And so we're very privileged today to welcome Bruce Bartlett to Economic Solutions. Bruce, it's good to see you.
Happy to be here.
Good. Did I leave out anything maybe important or that I should have mentioned about your background or other things you might want to mention?
Well, I also write for the Financial Times, which is sort of the Wall Street Journal of Europe, and that's about all.
Well, I think that's plenty. And you have a great deal of experience as an economist, as well as a strategic advisor to very high levels of government. And I think we're very privileged to have you on the show today. We've designed these questions based on your current book, and so I will proceed to ask you these questions, and maybe we'll discuss a little bit as we go through your responses. The first question comes from page 10 in your current book, where you say $3 trillion of the G.W. Bush tax cuts resulted in, quote, the second worst economic slump in economic history. How was that?
Well, we're still trying to figure out all the reasons that caused the recession that began back in 2007. But I think the point that I was trying to make there is that the Bush administration, that is the second one, passed huge tax cuts in 2001, 2002, 2003, and said we were going to get enormous increase in growth. And we never did. We never got any increase in growth. And as we know, before the end of his administration, we had the second worst economic slump in American history.
So was that an example of, as Ross Perot used to say, a trickle down that didn't trickle?
Well, it didn't trickle up either, really. About the only thing the Bush tax cuts did was add about $3 trillion to the national debt.
Okay. Then on pages 33 to 34 of your book, you explain the tax rate for the top 400 U.S. income earners was reduced from 30% in 1993 to less than 20% in 2002. Did this lead to significant investment by this group to help grow the U.S. economy and jobs?
Well, there's really no evidence of that. And keep in mind that the tax rates I'm referring to there are what economists call effective tax rates. That is, that's their tax payments divided by their income. And it is true that their tax rates fell very substantially. Just the tax, the revenues lost from that 400 group of 400 people probably cost us close to $1 trillion of revenue over the last 20 years. But there's really no evidence. As I said, it's the same argument that the Republicans said we would get if we cut the capital gains rate and cut the dividend rate, that we would get this, outpouring of growth and jobs, and it just never happened. All that happened was the rich got richer even faster than they otherwise would have.
And you're saying this as a former Republican. I guess you're an independent now politically, is that correct?
Yes, I pretty much broke with the Republican Party a few years ago. I wrote a book called Imposter: How George W. Bush Bankrupted America and Betrayed the Reagan Legacy. And since then, I no longer consider myself to be a Republican. But contrary to what some people think, I don't repudiate the work that I did when I was a Republican. I still support Reagan's policies. I just think that it was basically George W. Bush who drove the country and drove the Republican Party into a ditch.
Well, you show remarkable flexibility in your alignments this way, and in reading your books, I take it from the way you write. My impression is that you're a person who really looks at facts and has a lot of respect for relevant facts.
Well, certainly try to. When people ask me why I advocate different policies today than I advocated back in the 1980s, I give them a very simple answer. Circumstances have changed. The economy is different. Our problems are different. It seems to me ridiculous to have a one-size-fits-all economic policy. That's like saying the medicine you take for one disease, you should just take for every disease. I think that's nuts.
And that is the point I believe you made in the New American Economy book, that exact point.
Yes, I was writing that book as my ideas or my thinking was changing, and so the book is a little bit muddled because I wasn't entirely sure where I was going to end up.
Okay, and that kind of almost automatically answers my next question, which comes from pages 44 to 46 of your current book. Did the Reagan and G.W. Bush tax cuts pay for themselves?
Well, I don't think the Reagan tax cut did, although some people assert that it did. I think the best evidence is that maybe a third of the static or the accounting's revenue loss was recouped through faster economic growth and changes that people made to their investments and things of that sort. There's no evidence that any of the revenues from the George W. Bush administration were paid back at all. They just went dollar for dollar into the national debt.
Well, I really appreciate that answer, Bruce, and it also makes me think of one footnote to ask you. Quantitative easing, which is a euphemism for the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee buying corporate bonds. And so they're saying, well, look, we're going to put more money into the system by not just buying Treasury securities, but by buying private sector securities. I tend to think the government stimulus approach is more direct and productive. What do you think of this monetary quantitative easing approach?
Well, I felt all along that the Fed has not gone far enough in that direction. I still don't think they've gone far enough. We will know that the Fed's policies are working when we see the nominal gross domestic product rising, when we see interest rates rising, when we see prices rising. I know there are a lot of people out there who are just very, very worried about inflation, and they get very upset when interest rates rise. But those are all positive developments. We need to allow businesses to make more profits by being able to raise their prices. That's what will encourage them to increase production and hire new workers. And I really think that the Fed is doing what needs to be done. I just think they need to be doing it more in a better way that is really kind of too technical to talk about right here and now.
Okay, so your attitude then is let's go for the growth and hope we do get some inflation that will certainly be a sign of part of that growth.
Yes. I think the question was really about what we can do to stimulate growth right now. And frankly, I don't think there's much in the way of tax reform that's going to accomplish that. In fact, I don't think there's really anything on the tax side that will help. I think our biggest problems are really involve Federal Reserve policy, and I think that we could use some help on the spending side by having a public works program. God knows there's plenty of buildings and schools and roads and bridges that need to be rebuilt and repaired, and I think that we can now borrow money for practically nothing. I think we will look back in future years and say we were just crazy not to borrow to pay for improvements that would last for generations. And I think those are really the two things that would help more than anything else in the short run.
Okay, and moving on to the next question, which comes from page 61 of your book. Your book says, quote, in 2009, the top 20% of households earned more than half of all the income earned in the country. And 47% of those filing tax returns owed nothing, close quote. Also, according to the Government Accountability Office, 57% of U.S. companies and 72% of foreign corporations doing business in the United States paid zero taxes in at least 1 year between 1998 and 2005. Are most Americans and companies paying their fair share of taxes?
Well, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that what we're talking about here is the federal income tax. Obviously, there are other taxes, such as the payroll tax. And about half the people who don't owe any federal income taxes but nevertheless file returns do pay payroll taxes. So the total number of people that are not paying any federal taxes at all is actually much smaller than people think it is. And almost all of the people in that remaining half of the non-tax-paying population are either the elderly who are living only on Social Security or people who are just very, very poor. And we really, it would be unfair to tax those people. And of course, there's also state and local taxes, which are not included in that calculation. But there's additional evidence since I wrote my book of major corporations that are not paying any taxes, any income taxes. In 2010, General Electric, the largest industrial corporation in the world, had not only paid no federal income taxes, no corporate taxes, they got a $3 billion refund. And why people are not, concerned about this is really a mystery to me.
All right. So therefore, what we should properly say is that 57% of U.S. companies and 72% of foreign corporations are not paying income taxes. We should clarify the question to that then.
Well, that was only in one particular year. I mean, obviously, corporate profits go up and down. The last few years, they've obviously been down for a lot of corporations. But even before the recession began, there were several years in the last 10 in which General Electric had a zero tax liability. I'd have to look up the data for other corporations.
Right, and the question that we posed to you here actually covers the years 1998 through 2005, when supposedly we are reported that 57% of U.S. companies and 72% of foreign corporations paid zero. This was per Reuters, by the way, was our source on that.
Well, of course, that would have included the period of the 2001 recession, which in recessions always cause companies to run losses, and you don't expect the company to pay taxes when it's losing money. I think I'm more concerned about companies that today are very profitable but are utilizing loopholes in the tax code to avoid paying taxes. And the biggest loophole is that companies that earn profits in foreign countries don't have to pay taxes on on those profits as long as they keep the money in a foreign country. And there are companies like Microsoft that have billions upon billions of dollars stashed in foreign tax havens. I'll give you an anecdote about this. A few months ago, I needed a copy of Microsoft Word for a new computer, so I went to Microsoft.com to buy the software and download it. And when I gave them my credit card, my credit card company refused to authorize the purchase. So I checked with my credit card company to see what the problem was, and they said that the charge went to a company based in Luxembourg. Now, this was the main Microsoft website. Microsoft's, last time I checked, was based in Seattle, Washington. My money was going to Luxembourg. Now, Luxembourg is a well-known tax haven. So, and obviously what Microsoft has done, as many corporations do, is that they sell their patents or their trademarks or their copyrights to foreign subsidiaries for a nominal fee, and then all their profits are recognized in foreign countries. And this is a very serious problem. I've seen estimates that as much as $30 trillion worldwide, not just from U.S. citizens or corporations, but worldwide, may be just parked in tax havens such as the Cayman Islands and Bermuda and places of that sort.
$30 trillion.
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, the number sounds high to me, but even if it's only a fraction that large, that's still an awful lot of money.
Well, Bruce, we're segueing into our next question, which might even be rhetorical, I'm not sure. Is the present American tax system efficiently funding government?
It's not funding government at all, really. Federal revenues right now are only about 16% of GDP. The post-war average is 18.5% of GDP, and there's only been 1 year in the last 10 in which the revenues got as high as 18.5. So if taxes as a share of GDP, low taxes are a key to growth, we should have been growing like crazy for the last 10 years. So, and a lot of my Republican friends simply deny the possibility that low revenues contribute in any way whatsoever to the deficit. But the deficit is simply the difference between spending and revenues. So if revenues go down, then the deficit goes up. And obviously spending has gone up as well. But our deficit problem would be a lot better if we were at least collecting the amount of revenues that the government historically collects at this point in the business cycle. And I think ultimately we're going to need to raise taxes to get back to that level.
Well, that's very interesting. This leads to the next question, which comes from page 74 of your book. Quote, by and large, the wealthier a country, the heavier its tax levels. Denmark's tax to GDP ratio was 48% in 2008, and Sweden's was 46%. And you just mentioned a 16% rate and also an 18.5% rate, I guess.
Those numbers were for all levels of government, so they're not strictly comparable to the 16 number.
Compared to 26% for the United States, if you consider all taxes then. Okay. In 2006, the University of Leicester's National Happiness Study of 178 countries ranked Denmark number 1 and Sweden number 7, and the United States number 23. Do you think higher taxes in those two nations may be helping them be happier relative to the USA, and if so, how?
Well, I think it's certainly quite likely. One reason why these countries have higher taxes and why people may be happier there is that they have national health insurance. If you get sick and you're in Denmark, you don't pay anything. You just go to the doctor, you go to the hospital, they take care of you, they don't give you a bill. And as we know in this country, there's a very large number of people, a large percentage of the population, have no health insurance at all. Many people with health insurance have very poor insurance. They have problems dealing with their HMOs, and they're always worried about whether the insurance company is going to pay for a particular procedure that they may need. People in other countries do not have that problem. And basically, what they do is they simply pay higher taxes and have their health taken care of. We, for some reason, feel that it's better that we pay enormous amounts of our wages through our employer, and then have our employer decide who we will be insured by. I think this is a very inefficient system. We pay twice as much for health as a share of GDP as any other country. I think that's probably a very big reason why people in places like Sweden and are happier. They have less to worry about in terms of their health.
That's a very interesting piece of information, Bruce, because what the University of Leicester in fact found, that three variables accounted for 2/3 of the reasons for highest national happiness. The first one, as you just mentioned, was universal health care. That was number one. The second one was low poverty. They had to have low poverty in order to be happy as a country as a whole. And the third one was education. And of course, countries like Denmark, Sweden have no cost college education for everybody who wants to apply. And so those three variables explained 2/3 of the reasons for national happiness. And that was a tremendous stride, actually, in social sciences to actually survey this in the year 2006. Then going on to healthcare that you just mentioned, that Scandinavian and European healthcare costs are about half those in the United States. And yet those people do live healthier and longer than Americans. What can make America competitive in healthcare costs and services?
Well, think about the problems that employers have. They're having to pay enormous amounts for health insurance for their employees, which means the employees are not getting pay raises because all of their productivity gains are going into benefits, the cost of which rises very substantially every year. If we had some kind of national health insurance system that would eliminate the cost of health insurance for our businesses, their costs would drop very dramatically and make them much more competitive. Why this argument hasn't been made is really just a complete mystery to me.
Well, my own background started in international relations, and I wonder what you would think of the idea of, should America bring in some of these very successful foreign countries with regard to their health care, like Denmark and France, possibly Sweden, to consult with us on what would work for us?
Well, that's what I thought was going to happen in 2009 when we had a substantial debate in this country over health reform, and it never happened. As far as I can tell, neither the Obama administration nor anybody in Congress ever looked at the experience of other countries. We could just check with Canada. It's not like it's that far away. They speak the same language. They've had national health insurance there for many years. We could have invited the Canadians down and asked them what they do. We could have asked the Brits. They speak the same language. They have national health insurance. The Australians have national health insurance. We could have just checked with them. We checked with nobody. And as a consequence, I think we made a lot of mistakes. I think we're still making mistakes. I think the health reform that was passed in 2009 was an improvement by helping more people without health insurance to get it. But our health system is still fundamentally unchanged. We have to do something to reduce the costs, and that can be done. As I said, other countries pay half as much as a share of GDP for health as we do, and yet somehow or other we think their systems are too expensive, which is why we continue to have our grossly expensive system.
Well, that's very interesting, Bruce. also the Leicester Happiness Study found, by the way, that Canada is number 5 in national happiness. So even though we have anecdotal complaints about the Canadian system here in the United States, I hear people say, well, you can't get this and that if you go to Canada, but they do rank number 5 in national happiness in the world. So they must be doing quite a few things right when it comes to the 3 variables: universal health care, low poverty, and education.
And of course, all of those are generally provided by government, paid for out of taxes. And yet in this country, we're slashing the budgets of our state universities. We're slashing aid to students. We force them to go out and get loans that they have to repay to pay for their college education. And students today are now graduating from college with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. It will take them decades to pay that off before they can even begin to save for their own retirement or save to buy a house. I think this idea that we should always do things only through the private sector and force people to pay for everything themselves, which is really a Republican conservative idea, I think is demonstrably not working, and we have to do something else.
Well, that's a good point, too, and we've made this point in previous economic solutions programs, is that we want to differentiate this idea of socialism. I'm just going to make a quick parenthetical here. Socialism was defined by Karl Marx as government or communal ownership of the means of production, all means of production, and also property. What you're talking about here is channeling funding through government into the private sector to pay for these costs. And that's really what we call civic capitalism. We want to make that point again on this show, that socialism is something else. It's government ownership of these means of production and so on. So, police, fire departments, public schools, the Veterans Administration, healthcare, those are examples of socialistic approaches. But what we're talking about here of channeling resources through government into private sector, such as Medicare, for example, really falls under what we call civic capitalism. That's just a parenthetical on my part.
Well, you could call it social democracy. It's another term for essentially the same thing.
Okay. Now I want to ask you, page 175 of your book is on the flat tax. Your book explains that more revenue can be raised by a single tax rate against gross income, the so-called flat tax, than by the present income tax system, except a single rate for everyone would be regressive and more painful against the poor. So how about a graduated gross or graduated flat tax percentage based on 2 things, 2 categories? First, for businesses, on the standard industrial classification codes that businesses fit into because of different average profit rates for different industries, and then also gross income that a business makes within an SIC code, and then second, for individuals based strictly on gross income.
But the idea of taxing gross income, I think, is not a good idea. From the point of view, look at it from the point of view of a business. Businesses such as, say, food stores have large gross sales, but their net profits are not that high. Whereas, say, with jewelry stores, their total sales are quite low, but their profit per unit is very high. I think it would be grossly unfair to tax the gross sales of grocery stores and jewelry stores the same way. There has to be some allowance for legitimate costs, which is not to say there aren't lots of ways we could reform the tax system to get rid of illegitimate deductions. And I think that's really what we're talking about, is getting rid of deductions that companies now have that are just subsidies that do not contribute to the to greater production and are just giveaways.
All right, let's call it graduated gross tax. And remember, we have 2 criteria for businesses. One is the SIC code that they fall into. So obviously a supermarket has a very low margin on gross sales. I'm told it's around maybe 3%. Whereas if you are ExxonMobil, which is the largest company in the Fortune 500, and also perhaps the most profitable or most profitable, if you went by SIC codes and you first calculated against that, and then you went graduated gross within the SIC code, so you'd have a two-prong approach for businesses and then a one-tier approach for individuals of simply their gross. What do you think of that?
I don't think that's practical. One of the problems, the biggest problem we have on the corporate side is the problem of taxing multinationals who are able to move their production around from one country to another, taking advantage of local tax subsidies and things of that sort, and versus companies that are just do all of their sales in the United States. And you've also got problems between service-oriented companies and manufacturing companies. The whole corporate side is really a very, confusing system. And I think just saying, well, let's just use the SIC code, that's sort of an arbitrary classification that the Commerce Department uses mainly for statistical purposes to try to convert it into something that would apply to income taxes is I think impractical. It's an apples and oranges kind of thing.
Okay, now Bruce, we come to our last question, which is a big subject though, and treated very importantly in your book from pages 185 to 186 on this specific question. Your book says, quote, "The Congressional Budget Office estimates that spending for Social Security will rise from 4.8% of GDP in 2011 to 6.7% in 2035. You say, quote, "The kind of tax that raises the most revenue at less economic cost than any other tax is the value-added tax, and that VAT is used by, quote, every major country except the United States," close quote. What is the value-added tax, and how could it be implemented in America?
Well, the value-added tax is simply a sales tax, but it's a special kind of sales tax because it applies at every stage of production or distribution. So, for example, when a farmer grows wheat, he pays a tax, and that tax is then passed along to the miller who converts the wheat into flour, and then he pays the tax when the flour is sold, but he gets a credit for the taxes that were paid when he bought the wheat. And then when a baker turns the wheat into or the flour into bread, he pays the tax, but he also gets a credit then for the taxes that were paid by the miller, and also the taxes that were paid by the grower. And then finally, when the retailer sells the baked bread, he collects the total tax from the consumer, but he gets a credit for the taxes paid earlier. And the reason this is done is for two reasons. One is to improve compliance. So, for example, if the retailer fails to collect the tax at his end, you haven't lost 100% of the revenue. You've only lost the tax that would apply to the difference between what he paid to buy the bread from the wholesaler and what he would sell it for to the consumer. And so it improves compliance. And secondly, it eliminates a technical problem in taxation called cascading, which has to do with taxes being levied on top of taxes. And so it eliminates that problem. And for these and also, of course, being a consumption tax, it does not apply to a saving or investment. So for these reasons, it's a very efficient tax, by which I mean it discourages very little work, saving, and investment per dollar of tax raised, as compared to, say, the income tax, which is a very inefficient tax and probably has a cost, an economic cost to the economy of perhaps a third of all the revenue raised.
So your book says that the VAT is really the best generator of tax revenue for government.
That's right, and I think it's insane that we don't have one. We could use it, we could institute it in a revenue neutral manner. It doesn't even have to be done in such a way as to raise revenues. It could be used for tax reform. We could use the revenue to make all the Bush tax cuts permanent. We could get rid of the alternative minimum tax. We could fix the corporate tax. We could reduce the corporate tax rate, and still have plenty of revenue left over to make a down payment on deficit reduction. It's really foolish to oppose it, but the value-added tax is a very efficient form of taxation, by which I mean it discourages less saving and investment and work than any other form of taxation. Whereas the income tax has what economists call a dead weight cost that may be as high as a third of all revenues collected. So we're losing 5% of GDP or more simply because of the way we collect taxes, not from the amount of taxes, but from the way they are levied. If we had a value-added tax of 16% of GDP, we could raise the same revenue that the federal government now raises at much less economic cost.
And the value-added tax does end up charging the consumer for all those particular taxes along the way, does it not?
That's right. The tax is paid by governments, or rather by corporations, but the burden of the tax falls onto the consumer.
So ultimately, it is a type of sales tax.
Yes, it is a sales tax, but as I said, it's a very special form of sales tax. There are some people who believe it would be a good idea to collect all the federal revenues in a sales tax similar to that which the states have, where all of the tax is collected by the retailer. That's really a foolish idea. It would not work. You have to collect the taxes in the way the VAT does to be able to collect a significant amount of revenue.
Now, how do countries in Europe and Scandinavia that employ the value-added tax make sure that it's not too much of a burden on low-level income people? Or is it a problem with the poor people in various countries, or do they just not have as much of a poverty problem as we do?
Well, basically, it's your last point. They have a social safety net that protects the poor. They can simply raise welfare payments if the VAT goes up to keep the poor people from suffering. We don't have much of any kind of social safety net in this country. If you lose your job, and once your unemployment benefits run out, you're just out of luck. They don't do that in other countries. And they also have a lot of family allowances that go to families with children. There are payments the government makes regardless of your income. So even if you're wealthy and you have children, you'll get a check from the government in most of these countries to make sure that your children are adequately taken care of. Those payments can be easily adjusted to accommodate the VAT. So that's a key reason why they're able to have that kind of tax. It would be much more of a problem for us. We would have to institute some new type of system, some kind of rebate mechanism, negative tax or something, to prevent the tax from being excessively burdensome to poor people.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. You've been very informative to all of us here, and I think we've learned a lot on this show. I encourage people to read these two books, The New American Economy and also The Benefit and the Burden, Tax Reform, Why We Need It and What It Will Take. We've been very privileged to have you on the program, Bruce. Most informative and educational, and I know I'm going to watch the show repeatedly. Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make about anything?
Well, I would just like to say this is only the second time I've ever done an interview by Skype, and it's quite interesting, and I hope it turns out okay.
Well, it looks good on our end, and I think we're ushering in part of a new technological era, at least in this part of California. And here we are talking with you in Washington, D.C. I think this does herald the future, and I sure am very grateful you've been on the program. Thanks again.
Thank you.